they're experts at these kinds of wicked, destructive, improvised explosive devices. Under no circumstances, if I were advising Netanyahu, would I entertain any kind of permanent ceasefire. Every day is an existential threat for the Israeli people.
Hello, and welcome to On the Homefront. I'm Jeff Duden. In light of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, I reached out to my friend, retired U.S. Brigadier Army General Anthony Tata, who through his 28 years of service has acquired on-the-ground, first-hand understanding of the macro geopolitical landscape of this region, as well as the tactical challenges faced by all parties involved. I believe this conversation with Tony will add to your understanding of this very complicated and difficult conflict from Tony's perspective. Thank you for listening. Welcome, everyone, to the Homefront this morning. We have retired Brigadier General Tony Tata, U.S. Army, on with us today. Welcome, Tony.
Great to be with you, Jeff. Thank you.
Tony, the reason that I asked you to come on this morning was to talk about the situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip. From an educational perspective, myself and many others, as this has escalated, has gone to the internet and spent a lot of time researching the region and the actions and reactions that are happening. And I really wanted to get your perspective as somebody who's traveled the world and has spent a lot of time in this area in diplomacy, and try to get an understanding of, or maybe raise our understanding of what's going on over there right now. I'd like to start from a macro perspective, if you would speak to the geopolitical situation. What challenges does the geography that exists create, and maybe set the scene for a deeper conversation around some specific issues?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff, for the opportunity. The state of Israel, and there are a lot of debates about when it came into existence, how long Jewish people have been there. We're getting ready to celebrate the birth of Christ, a Jew from 2,000 plus years ago. So put all of that aside, because that's something that academics and internet warriors will come up with different facts or make up different facts to argue whose land that is. It is somewhat of a territorial dispute, but let's just take the situation as it is today. The state of Israel is a piece of land on the Mediterranean Sea. They've got Lebanon in the north. They've got in the northeast Syria that press along what's called the Golan Heights. You got Jordan in the east, and you have Egypt in the southwest. And inside Israel, you've got the Gaza Strip to the south that borders between the southern reaches of Israel and Egypt, the western or eastern portions of Egypt. And then you've got the West Bank, which is inside Israel, that sort of surrounds Jerusalem, where the embassy was moved to. So you have the Jewish people, and Israel was really established as a safe place, a safe state for the Jewish people post-World War II. And the Arabs around, and some are very moderate and get along great with Israel, and some are not so moderate and want to eradicate Israel and the people that reside there. A lot of this is fomented, Jeff, by Iran. Iran has habitually exported since the early 80s, after the fall of the Shah and the rise of the theocracy there. The terrorist groups throughout Yemen, the Houthi rebels, way down on the south part of the Arabian Peninsula, the Shia militia groups in Iraq that continuously attack U.S. bases and forces situated in Iraq and Syria. And then you have Hezbollah in the north of Israel in Lebanon. And then you have Hamas, who is sort of the primary antagonist right now, all funded by Iran and as terrorist proxies for carrying out their own ends, ways, and means for Iranian foreign policy. And so that's sort of the setting the table for what's happening today. On October 7th, Hamas conducted a surprise attack into Israel and really murdered, slaughtered, innocent Jewish people at a concert in their homes, and conducted atrocities that are not consistent with the Geneva Conventions, which is an important distinction because people try to make a moral equivalency between what Hamas has done and what Israel's doing. And Israel, I've been there. I've been to the Golan. I've been down to the border with Gaza. I've been to Jerusalem. And I've laid a wreath in the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem with the Israeli Defense Forces. So I understand the culture of the people, the threats that they face, and it's every day is an existential threat for the Israeli people. And adhering to the Geneva Conventions and adhering to minimization of civilian casualties is paramount in everything that I've seen the Israeli Defense Forces do as I've operated with them. And so I say all of that to provide the larger context. They are surrounded. They have a constant threat. And Iran is funding all of these different groups. And essentially what you have is someone that's, if a football team is on your 1 yard line every play and you have to have a goal line stand, that's essential, to use a football analogy. That's essentially what Israel is having to do, is prevent that touchdown. And on October 7th, the defense didn't hold up on that goal line stand, to use that metaphor.
So this is an ongoing conflict using many proxies. And when you research this, you realize that there's always attacks and counterattacks. There's always anti-terrorism operations going on. There's people getting killed all the time between all these factions. And what would the events of the 7th do? What would be the strategy, in your opinion, around that to escalate this conflict in such a drastic manner?
Why would Iran and Hamas do that?
Yes. What was the strategic? You have to. None of these actions happen in a bubble. They might be new to us, but they're not new to the ongoing relations between the countries. They had to understand that this was taking things to a new level, and so you have to assume it was done with intention.
Yep.
Great strategy. What would be the strategy behind something like that?
Yeah, the strategy is Iran sees the traction that the Abraham Accords were getting in the normalization of relations between Arab nations and the Jewish state, Israel. And for example, UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, Morocco and Israel, others, even Egypt, lots of initiatives. And the essence of the Abraham Accords, however maligned they get by mainstream media, is that you use economics to bridge centuries of hatred, and that are sort of baked into the cultures. And so a lot of traction there with that, and a lot of and I was part of that when I served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The Abraham Accords included weapons packages that helped create offsetting balances of power and that kind of thing. And so, I spent a lot of time talking to both, for example, UAE and Israel policy peers within their ministries of defense, and making sure that we had this right. And I mentioned that because it was well along the way. It was fully baked in some cases and partially baked in other cases, where these economic relations were starting to trickle down and normalize relations between the countries, where the more that you can exchange ideas and cultures, and you say, well, they're not that bad. They're not that bad. And so Iran can't have that, right? Because they're a theocracy, and it's in their national interest to drive the United States out of the Middle East and eliminate the state of Israel. And so Iran and the Shia influence, Iranians are Shia for the most part, and then most of the rest of the Arabian Peninsula is Sunni, and they have a lot of disagreement. But in this case, the Arab world is aligning to support one another in at least with information and statements and diplomacy to try to have the back of the Palestinian people. And so the overall strategic goal of Iran, who calls all these shots from a terror exportation standpoint, is to disrupt the momentum of the Abraham Accords and the normalization of relations with Israel by other Arab states, and to continue to foment distrust and discontent in the region, so that Iran can continue to expand its hegemony in the Arabian Peninsula.
It seems like there are many paths to escalation, maybe first and foremost coming from Lebanon through Hezbollah with their weaponry that they have and their ongoing conflicts that they've had with Israel in Golan and the other areas. What do you see as the greatest opportunity for this conflict to escalate to a much broader situation?
Yeah. About 2-3 weeks ago, you had Hezbollah in the north with, the leader was getting ready to make a big statement. He made a big statement, and everybody was concerned that Hezbollah was going to come in and attack from the north, and Syria was going to attack from the northeast, and harken back to the mid 70s when you had major tank battles and where Israel was having to defend from interior lines in the north and the south and so forth. That was a concern. I didn't see that, and I was pretty consistent on whether I was on. It didn't matter what cable news show I was on. I said I believe that Hezbollah is a fixing operation, and fix is a military term, to make Israel have forces in the north so that you can't reinforce in the south. So it dilutes your ability to mass on the real threat, which was Hamas in the south. And so they did probing, they've exchanged artillery and all that. That's classic feint fixing operation, to use military terms. Syria, I don't think ever really seriously ginned anything up. The real threat for escalation, and it's a coin toss, and depending on who you talk to, there is reticence in the administration today to confront Iran in a major way. And we've talked for last few minutes about how Iran is fomenting all this discontent, not only fomenting, funding and supplying weapons, and also the rhetoric that goes with it. And so do you treat the symptoms, which is Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis, or do you treat the disease, which is the theocracy in Iran? And I think from a policy perspective, if I were in my old job advising the president, certainly one of the options to be laid on the table for the president to look at would be an option that takes on, in a non-boots on the ground way, Iran and attempting to dismantle some of their oil infrastructure, reimpose very strict sanctions, because remember, the administration lifted the sanctions on Iran. They are now selling billions of dollars of oil to China, and a lot of that money, they unfroze assets to go to Iran. And even though that's supposedly earmarked for humanitarian aid, it's fungible, right? If I know somebody's going to be paying my mortgage, then I can take that 10,000, 5,000, or whatever it is, and use it for other things, right?
Tony, are those policy decisions that you just mentioned connected directly to what we're seeing happen today?
Yeah, I think so. I think the policy decision to eliminate the sanctions on Iran, or not enforce them is probably a better way to put it, to unfreeze Iranian assets in exchange for some hostages that Iran had, to take the Houthis off the terrorist list. All of these things are done in an attempt to appease Iran, but we don't get anything back from Iran, right? I mean, there's no, what we get is they were training the Hamas operatives in Iran, teaching them how to do the parachuting in and the tactics, and they rehearsed the October 7th event in Iran. And so this laissez-faire approach is very different than the maximum pressure campaign that was in the previous administration, that was having some effect on their ability to export terror throughout the region. And so that policy makes a difference. And so what we're seeing today is a result of a more funded Iran, a more emboldened Iran. And frankly, one of the things that concerns me is the intelligence failure that happened here. There was an intelligence failure from the U.S. standpoint in Ukraine also, and then there was an intelligence failure obviously in Afghanistan. And so when I think about the border, U.S. border, is that the fourth intelligence failure that we're gonna find out about? And so obviously these national security is best done in a proactive way. figuring things out ahead of time, predicting what's happening, having policies that attempt to shape it so that you have less opportunity for those that want to harm us to harm us. So I'm really concerned about that. What's that fourth intelligence failure that's out there right now?
Well, simply put, once somebody shows you who they truly are, believe them. And the core of the ideology in Iran was not going to change, regardless of us loosening, unfreezing assets or loosening restrictions on them. And so we've got what we bought right now.
Right.
And with respect to the border, I've talked to more than one person in circles, and there's a big concern that we've probably let in some people that maybe we shouldn't have, kind of nestled in with everybody else that's coming in with the loosened restrictions and whatnot. So, which is a concern domestically for our security.
Yeah, absolutely. Any government's job is to first and foremost protect their people and their property. So talking about Israel, Netanyahu's job is to create a national security, a secure space, a secure terrain for the Jewish people to live. Same thing with this administration. The security of U.S. Citizens is job number one of any administration, and the policies of any administration should reinforce domestic security, because national security is a domestic issue. If people don't feel safe, then certainly they can't pursue life, liberty, and happiness, right? So consistent with our Constitution. So it's in today's world, national security and domestic security are inextricably intertwined, and certainly having operated around the world. And when I was in Afghanistan and we were raiding Al-Qaeda and Taliban hideouts in our intelligence, we assessed that we disrupted 2 plots to attack the United States. This was pretty early on in the whole Afghanistan drive, but to the extent that we can have intelligence assets that are working with other nations so that we can have eyes on, ears on, pictures, etc., imagery, signals, and so forth, to build an intelligence picture to continuously assess the threat, and then take appropriate action within the United States. That's sort of the whole purpose of our intelligence community and our national security community.
Moving back into the conflict at hand, and speaking of intelligence, signal mapping within the region, identifying cell phones of known operators of Hamas, mapping tunnels. Apparently the majority of the weaponry and the forces can or are contained underground, which makes it very difficult to identify movement and also to access by the IDF, and then identifying operations, bases of operations, bases of where they're launching or defending. What role, where were the intelligence failures specifically leading up to the situation, And then what do you believe from an intelligence perspective is important right now?
Yeah, so on the failure side, the United States has intelligence sharing agreements, arrangements with Israel, and I'm told that some of those were adjusted, rearranged, not enforced in light of this overall outreach to Iran over the last year or two, which would explain either why we weren't watching or if we watched and saw and didn't share. Either one is really bad, but that would explain sort of the failure aspect. And when you're trying to reach out to Iran, who, as you said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. If they're shouting death to America, death to Israel, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of negotiation space there. In this outreach, one of the things that we found is, and Congress found this out, there were 3 or 4 Iranian, some call them spies, some call them sympathizers, but they have top secret clearances and they work in the Department of Defense and Department of State. And so it's not too hard to draw a line between, for example, the Chief of Staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations is she's a U.S. citizen of Iranian descent, but communicates regularly with the Supreme Council in Iran. And these emails were uncovered. Before congressional testimony, she would go and make sure that she's saying what the Iranian Supreme Council wants her to say. And it's not a stretch to assume that if she has access to every piece of intel that comes in, particularly with reporting to the number 2 there, reporting to the Special Ops Assistant Secretary, who, when I was the under, reported to me. These people weren't there, of course. It's not a stretch to assume that intel was just not shared. So you could get a micro look at it like that, and in a macro sense, the appeasement strategy with Iran, perhaps they just weren't watching. And the worst case speculation is they knew and didn't tell. I would never speculate that, but it's certainly I've seen people. So that's the failure part. Now, what's important now, and I've been, this pause business where Israel, gets attacked, and then all of a sudden, immediately, you have people saying, "Oh, don't strike back," or as soon as they get some momentum, "Oh, you need to slow down." We need to let Israel defend itself, right? If Israel's not safe for the Jewish people, then what's the point, right? And what I know about combat operations is that when you have signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, human intelligence, every layer of intelligence that you can possibly have, you can use what precious time you have to develop good plans that protect your people, and then try to go find the hostages, try to go and destroy Hamas, who attacked you, and that momentum, offensive momentum, has a quality all its own that's really hard to capture, because as you're pressuring Hamas, they have to communicate. They have to say, "Hey, I'm getting attacked over here. I'm moving over here. I'm going here," um, and they have to move because either that or they die or get overrun or get captured. And so when you have people talking and moving, all your intelligence assets are able to pick up on that, and it creates this operations intelligence cycle that gets inside the decision cycle of the enemy, Hamas, and allows you to be more successful. And what these pauses do that are being coerced onto Netanyahu and others by people who frankly, don't understand what I just said, or perhaps they do and want Hamas to be able to regroup and refit, because it's like a pick six in a touchdown or in a football game. You've got all this momentum, and then you've got to stop, and now they're refitting, and your intelligence isn't as good, right? So that's to use another football analogy, and I do that because you were a football star upstate. So,
so the latency, any latency between an insight garnered by intelligence and a resultant formalized plan and subsequent action reduces the quality or the effectiveness of the intelligence itself.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. You could apply that to the business world or whatever, but now that we're paused, right, and the pressure on Netanyahu has got to be enormous, right, because these hostages that are being doled out in a barbaric fashion, little kids, children, women, 80-year-old, 70-year-old women, and it gets heralded by the media as if it's the benevolent Hamas captors. It's barbaric, but what's happening is that Israel Defense Forces are hunkered around Gaza City now and continuing internal cleanup operations, right? Cordon and searches. And so the pause to me comes at sort of a natural time in the operational sense of you have tactics, operations, and strategy. Operationally, I think Netanyahu played it about right. He got Gaza City. He's got it surrounded. There's still a lot of little tactical skirmishes happening inside all of that. He's clearing the tunnels. He's clearing the building. He's got a lot of work to do to make sure that that's 100%. There's no enemy in there, and so he can pause now and begin, and I hope and I'm sure that he's planning for the next phase to go to southern Gaza, which is a different kind of warfare, and it's going to be some of it's more open land, and it's a different kind of fight than the urban fight that he's had. There is some obviously urban in the southern part of Gaza, but if they're able to get the hostages back, and or the great majority of them, and continue to plan, under no circumstances, if I were advising Netanyahu, would I entertain any kind of permanent ceasefire, because he's got to get to southern Gaza. And Israel, in my view, what I know about all of the actors and players here, Israel needs to clean that place out and dominate it, dominate that battle space, and then reconstruct it, and then figure out some path forward. I don't think the UN is a good arbiter. They have they have too many Islamic extremist sympathizers inside the UN that don't like Israel. And as borne out by the statements coming from the UN Secretary General and others. And so it would be a good opportunity for a NATO out of area mission or some combination of UN, NATO, and even the African Union coming together, some kind of global peacekeeping thing. Because you look at Gaza, it's right there on the Med, and much like Beirut, it's been destroyed by this Islamic extremism. And it's unfortunate because the people there, Beirut used to be the banking center of the Middle East. And today it's a hollow shell of itself. And Gaza could have been, if all these millions and billions being sent for weapons had been sent for hotels and restaurants and economic development, it would be a resort now.
And it's all beachfront.
It's all beachfront property.
Yeah.
But Iran doesn't want that. They want the hatred. They want the division. They want these people to suffer. Everybody, the Palestinians, they don't care. The Supreme Council there, they don't care. They want people to suffer so that they can continue to foment discontent.
From a diplomatic perspective, what is the value of hostages to Hamas, and how do you anticipate them maximizing their leverage in that regard?
Yeah, well, I mean, we put a price recently on hostages about $1 billion apiece with from a monetary standpoint with Iran. 6 hostages, $6 billion. And then, a few weeks later, after that deal, there's American hostages being held by extension, Iran. So it's we very clearly defined the monetary value of hostages. Now, these hostages, are fungible, just like money is fungible. So one Israeli or one American hostage in Hamas, the barter that's been defined is you will release one hostage taken not in accordance with Geneva Conventions for 3 Palestinians terrorists who were detained in accordance with Geneva Conventions. So that's a pretty outsized gain for the Palestinians, but this is the tough spot that Netanyahu is in, is that if you've got parents staring at you, I want my 3-year-old child back that's being held by Hamas. I mean, how do you say no to that as a leader? And understanding that you have an overarching responsibility to ensure that this never happens again. And so that tension between creating the buffer, defeating Hamas, and getting the hostages back is a very small eye of the needle to thread. And I think he's doing it. I think he's doing it well. The value notice that I think there's been one at the time that we're talking, one American, a young little girl released, and the other Americans are probably they're the $1 billion a piece hostages, right? So the transactional value is 3 terrorists for 1 hostage, non-American, and then 1 American hostage for $1 billion. So that seems to be kind of what if they're looking at a spreadsheet, what they ought to be able to get, which I'm sure they've developed. But it's larger than that too, because there's this. They're able to they being the Hamas, is able to now dilute the anger. The longer this goes on, they almost appear benevolent. Oh, we're going to release 10 more. Oh, we're going to release 10 more. They could, at any day release them all and quit firing rockets at Israel, but they choose to, in a very barbaric, sinister way, hold these hostages. And they're not being held just by Hamas. They're being held by Palestinians. A doctor was holding one, a teacher was holding one. So, Israel's not far off when they say that, there's not as many innocents as you believe. If these people are holding the hostages, why not just turn them over? If you're a doctor and your duty is to first do no harm, or if you're a teacher used to dealing with children, why not on your own accord turn them over? And of course, the answer is because they'll be shot and killed by Hamas. So it's a barbaric situation there that we need to learn some lessons from this, and I'm concerned that maybe we're not.
While we're talking about the people, are there NGOs for humanitarian aid that are able to operate in this environment? And if so, who are they and what challenges are they facing?
Yeah, so the non-governmental organizations and private volunteer organizations, NGOs, PVOs, they the Red Cross, of course, is the big one. The UN. There is a heavy slant toward the anti-Israel slant, in large part toward these NGOs. And when you talk about the aid getting in, that's been part of the mantra here is. Pause so you can release hostages, and pause so that we can get aid in, and this potpourri of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to bring in the aid. My question, and what I talk about, is when I'm on TV or wherever, is what if Iran is able to get rocket launchers and ammunition and rations, etc., to the Hamas fighters. Why can't they get the supplies into the Palestinian people? That's the first thing. The second thing is that the Palestinian people that are exiting to the south, why don't the neighboring Arab nations, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, take them in? And there's a reason for that, right? I think, part of it is they don't want to, they want to keep those people are fodder for the larger geopolitical issue of whether or not Israel belongs there, right? They're the cannon fodder for the fight, that the indefinite fight that is that is Iran wants to go into infinity, and so they don't want them to leave because they want them to be stuffed right in there and suck it up and suffer whatever consequences that Israel has to levy on them after Israel has been attacked. These NGOs that come in there really see one side of this thing, and it's true. Every war-torn area I've been, it doesn't matter who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, however you define that. Women and children and young men and old men and old women, citizens, they're all human, and we lose sight of this human aspect. With all the dehumanization that is going on today from governments and techno-fascism and politics of personal destruction and the dehumanization effort, we forget. Everybody tends to forget that the young girls that were raped and killed at the concert in southern Israel, they were humans. They had families. The kids, the young Palestinian families, they're humans, and they just trying to live a life. And there are cultures and education, indoctrination that goes on. That is detrimental to this larger goal that we should have of we're all on this planet. None of us are making it out alive, and we should try to get along, because everybody's just a human trying to get along. And these NGOs, some of them are good, and that's what they do. And some of them have ill intent, and they end up, from a social media standpoint, perhaps spreading misinformation. And I won't name names, because I feel like everybody's trying to find some path forward here with this travesty that's happening.
From a tactical perspective, we're talking about people, and in Gaza, and as you mentioned, these are families with children that have hopes, dreams. They want their children to do well. They want them to be educated. Everybody wants the same for their children. We want our children to live a life, better than we did, whatever that means. And so the crisis is real on all sides of this for those people. And one of the analysis that I was watching was talking about really a couple of things that would slow down operations. Number one is the people. So asking people to, warning them and saying, we're going to Gaza City, we're going to start in the north. We need everybody to move to the south. And then they said, now that we're here, we're going to be moving to the south, and everybody needs to move to the sea. And it's, that puts a lot of pressure on the civilians who are trying to get out of harm's way and carry whatever they have on their backs and then move to the south. And of course, there may be forces that are telling them, no, you need to stay right where you are, because if you're here, then that slows things down. And the other thing I'd like you to, comment on from a velocity perspective or a challenge perspective is these tunnels, right? So I'm not a historian, but in the South Pacific in World War II, I think we dealt with tunnels. In Vietnam, we dealt with tunnel warfare. Has the ability to, is it? I don't know, but I'm asking you, the standard operating procedures for dealing with tunnel systems, entrenched combatants inside of that. Is there anything you can do other than send people down there and have it out in these areas? And the extensiveness of the tunnels, many of them in Gaza are concrete fortified, reinforced. There's some logistical things like some tracks and wagons and things like that. So it's a very sophisticated and ongoing operation to expand the network of these tunnels. And you can move people even from Gaza into Israel in some cases with the tunnels near the border. So how have the dealing with the tunnels and also then the complication of the civilians, how does that slow down operations for the objectives of the IDF?
Yeah, Islamic extremists in the last 20 years of combat that we've seen have no issue, and Hamas I would put in that category, using civilians as human shields. It's just it's part of the game for them. And So you're right when you say, they're not allowed to leave, because having civilians on the battlefield complicates things immensely for people who don't think the way that these extremists think, and they actually value human life and they want to preserve human life. And I know that Israel, I've been in their operations center, they take extreme caution when targeting anything, and to try to minimize or eliminate civilian casualties. And of course, in combat, that's really, really, really hard. So that's the first thing. Now, on the tunnels, what I would say is that it's, the issues are related, in that if with the tunnels, if you indiscriminately try to bomb and close the tunnel mouth or collapse it or whatever, you don't know if they put a bunch of civilians in there or a bunch of hostages in there. And so, and I've been in a couple of tunnel mouths in southern Israel that connected to Gaza that they had cemented. They found them. I mean, these things are just like, holes in the desert, and it just, they pop up, and they're very challenging to find. There are different, my last assignment in the Army, I was leading the counter roadside bomb effort called Joint IED Defeat Organization. And we had about $4 billion trying to, this was at the peak of our young men and women being attacked by Iranian, mostly, improvised explosive devices. Soleimani had created the explosively formed penetrator. And one of the things that we saw, a couple of things we saw, is that if we had a tunnel or we had a house, they could rig that to explode when a American unit went in there, for a four-man squad going in to clear a house, or you go under a bridge on a road, you collapse it. Lots of different things can happen. And so this Iranian connection, they're experts at these kinds of wicked, destructive, improvised explosive devices, and so as you look at the tunnels, you've really got to approach each one independently and very cautiously. We developed, our private sector developed, we helped fund a ground penetrating radar that could find tunnels to some depth, and actually see what's in there. And so to the extent that, and when I was in this job, I was part of my working with the Israeli Defense Forces. I'm hopeful that in the last 12, 15 years, that technology has matured and gotten much better. It was decent back then, and if it's improved, then they're able to either have something low like a drone go fly and look for anomalies that find these tunnels, or something high, and that can cover more terrain and find something that you could then send ground troops to, and then you can assess it. And there are ways to look at the tunnel and put some, we've got robotics that can get in there, and cameras and so forth to protect human life. You can send, a bot inside that can then transmit back what they're seeing. And then if you're pretty sure, or 100% sure that there's nothing to it, close both ends of it and be done with it, right? And move on to the next one. So I think these tunnels are more logistical networks that move to the hospital where they had their command center beneath it, or they moved to the elementary school where they have another command center. This is how fiendish Hamas is. They put all of their command centers beneath the kinds of things that normal human beings would say, please don't go near that hospital, elementary school, it's a daycare center. But that's what they use as their shield, right? And so it comes full circle back to the use of civilians on the battlefield with these tunnels.
Tony, thank you so much for being on today. This has been an incredible education for all of us on the home front. If you were advising the administration today, what would you have them consider that they might not be considering right now to improve the situation as best as possible?
Yeah, great question. I always look at things for really the elements of national power. What national power can we bring to bear on the situation that serves our national interest? Because at the end of the day, that not to be harsh, but that's all that matters, right? U.S. national interest. This administration, any administration's number one job is to serve the American people. And so what best serves the American people? There's a domestic component and there's an international component. My advice, for what it's worth, is to domestically reignite an aggressive energy exploration and permitting process, so that we can become a net exporter of fossil fuels, while also having the green agenda that, decarbonization and all that, which, is important. And what that does is it eliminates a major concern of, it reduces the relevance of the Persian Gulf to the United States. And that reduces perhaps the number of troops that we need to have over there for actions on the Arabian Peninsula. So that would be the first thing. The rest of the world gets their oil from that area. But if we can be a net exporter, that means that it's not as important to us. The second thing I would say is that Iran is, believe them when they speak, death to America. They're not benevolent. They will never be benevolent. And so take a different approach with Iran. Show the big stick, that Teddy Roosevelt thing, speak softly, carry big stick, and compel them to stop this exportation of terror throughout the Middle East. The funding that goes to Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis and Shia militia groups. And if they don't, then there should be some punitive action. And we can do that from afar. We can dismantle a oil field, oil infrastructure. What is it that Iran cares most about financially? Their oil infrastructure, their nuclear reactors. We can very easily impact those. So I would have a flexible deterrent option, as they're called, on the table, that if Iran doesn't, tell Iran, from an information management standpoint, Iran, stop this, or we're going to consider something more harsh. And then diplomatically, so diplomacy, information, military, economic. Diplomatically, I would stop this engagement, a meaningless engagement with Iran, because it leads nowhere. It leads to October 7th, and just get harsh with them. And then from a military standpoint, have the option prepared to be harsher with Iran because they're the disease. Everything else is a symptom. And then economically, I would reimpose very, very strict sanctions, and I would enforce those sanctions, and in particular, so that they can't send the amount of oil they're sending to China. One of the second order impacts of all of what's happened over the last 3 years is that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have coalesced and become much closer from a cooperation standpoint, because they see us as a common enemy that is not acting in our own nation's best interests. And so their opportunity for hegemony, for territorial aggrandizement, Ukraine, Israel, Afghanistan, all of that, they see as an opportunity. And so I would recommend flexing a little muscle and shoring it up through diplomatic, information, and economic means.
They've certainly taken advantage of our lack of focus.
Yeah, no question about that.
Tony, thank you for your service, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today on the Homefront.
Always my privilege to talk to you, Jeff, and the Homefront Brands team.
All right. Take care. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.